such a big pleasure to be here hosting this high-level panel. In education events like this, there's quite often a lot of discussion about making change happen in schools. And we all understand that it is, of course, of utmost importance. We are quite often discussing about why, meaning why is there a need for education to change? And quite often the answer is something like, because the world is changing, education needs to change as well. It's based on the industrial model and so forth. Then there's also discussion about what should the future of education look like, and quite often it's a lot like what we heard in a beautiful keynote just a few minutes ago. It's kind of like teaching kids how to fly even if the branches broke and so forth. And it should be more child-centric. We have to find new ways to assess and so on. But there's one discussion which is lacking from the discussion a lot at the moment. And the discussion is how should we make the change happen at scale so that we are not leaving anyone behind. We are taking care of the kids, we are taking care of the teachers, we are also informing about the change for parents and so forth. And that's why I'm so excited about the report that is coming out, or it's a provocation, actually publication coming out today, and you can download. There's a link. There's going to be a link on the screen. You can download the first version of the report, where it's created by Big Change together with 3 partners: Teach for All, 100, and Rewired, and it's sort of like trying to approach why is the change needed, but also how could you make that happen at scale? And it's a really complicated thing. So please go and download the report, and then we are moving on to the panel. We are having a really high-level panel, and we start with introductions of the panelists. So please, Wendy, can you start the introductions?
Hi, everyone. I'm Wendy Kopp. I am the CEO and co-founder of Teach for All, which is a global network of independent, locally led organizations in more than 60 countries that share a common approach for developing what we call collective leadership for ensuring all children fulfill their potential.
Andreas.
I'm Andreas Schleicher, Director for Education Skills at the OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. We develop global educational standards. If you hear something about the PISA assessment, that's us.
Beautiful, and then we should have 3 people online. Maybe we start with Fred from Africa. Fred, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Great to see everyone. My name is Fred Swanika. I'm the founder of the African Leadership Group. Our mission is to transform Africa by developing its next generation of leaders. So we're trying to reimagine higher education by deploying a student-driven model of learning by doing, and we believe that the end goal of education is really not to memorize facts and figures, but to learn how to learn and ultimately to create interdisciplinary problem solvers for society.
Beautiful, thank you, Fred. And then we move to India. Vishal, are you there?
Yes, Saku, I'm here. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you. Hello, everyone. I'm Vishal, calling in from Bangalore, India. Co-founder of Dream a Dream, an organization focused on empowering young people from vulnerable backgrounds to overcome adversity and to learn to flourish and thrive in the 21st century. And we do this by working with governments across India and helping them transform education through curriculum, teacher training, and policy practice and research. Thank you.
Thank you. And last but not least, to London, Essie.
Morning, Saku. Hi, everybody. I'm Essie North. I'm the CEO of Big Change, and we act as a catalyst for how can we support all young people to thrive in life, not just in exams. And that means that we back pioneers who are thinking and demonstrating new ways of possible, and we work with allies across the system to see how we can be a catalyst for system change.
Thank you, Essie. And my name is Saku Tuominen, and I'm the chair and founder of 100, a Helsinki-based education non-profit. What we are trying to do is that we identify impactful and scalable education innovations, and then we help them spread. But let's start with Essie briefly. Essie, why the report, why the publication? What was the thinking behind that one, and why now?
We have the honor of being able to work with so many different leaders across education and asking them questions all the time about what change is needed, why is it not happening, and what can we do differently. And you'll see many of the leaders represented on this panel today that we've been working and learning with over the years. And we were hearing very similar themes around the fact that we needed to step back and really think about what we're aiming for in education and really kind of work with the system, the broader learning ecosystem, in order to drive change. And we saw that there was lots of brilliant work being done by all of these different organizations. They were all being talked about slightly differently, and there was a real opportunity to come together and talk about collectively why change is needed, what that looks like, and share some of the lessons that we've all learned from our different experiences about how to make that possible. And as we said, share this as a provocation to discussion, to really thinking about how we can move from thinking about incremental changes and what we're thinking about as reform, so just making the current model work better, to actually thinking about what are the broader goals, what are we really aiming for, bigger ambitions in the long term, and how do we get there?
Thank you, Essie. And let's start with the definition of what kind of change are we looking for, what kind of change is needed. And if you want to simplify it, there's two versions. One is incremental change, reform, which means that we are improving the system as it is. And the second one is more like a transformation, which is of course more ambitious but more complex, because education, as we all know, is a really complex collection of ecosystems and so forth. Andreas, maybe we start with you. Is that, are you in the reform or transformation category, and why so?
Yeah, thank you, Saku. First of all, I think we should remind ourselves that everything around us here is the fruit of education. You know, that we got here, that we are able to talk here at Rewired about the future of education. All the technology around us, we should be incredibly proud of what education has accomplished. But we should also be aware that this education has produced some fundamental disconnects in our society. You know, the disconnect between the infinite growth imperative and the finite resources of our planet, the disconnect between the financial economy and the real economy, now the disconnect between what is technologically possible and the real social needs of people, now the disconnect between, you know, our ways of governing ourselves and the voicelessness of people. And you can say, you know, the SDGs are meant to put all of this together to create that missing glue in this time of accelerations. But once again, you know, the extent to which those sustainable development goals will become a reality is about what happens today in our classrooms. And if you ask yourself, you know, are the spaces, the technology, the people, the time fit to achieve that, you get to the point where, you know, this is not about optimizing this. This is really about transforming our education systems. Our schools, you know, are just waking up to the digital age, you know, that is going to radically transform learning. We need to get ready for this. I think this is about, you know, not just doing a little bit from where we are, but really thinking about a different form of education. An education, you know, that is opening minds, not building curiosity, that is, you know, building compassion, opening hearts, that is building courage, you know, helping people to mobilize their cognitive, social, emotional resources. And those are also our best bets against the biggest threats of our times, you know, ignorance, the closed mind, hate, the closed heart, and you know, fear, the enemy of that agency that we want to build for tomorrow.
So you are definitely on the transformation camp. Brief question, do you think that pandemia has made transformation easier or more complicated?
It depends, you know. Obviously the pandemic has just, you know, accelerated many of the inequalities in our education. You know, every little fracture in our education system has become a huge crack. But I do think it has given people new spaces. You know, I hope that, you know, I'm sure after this pandemic, you're going to have many young people going back to their teachers and say, you know, actually, I learned how to discover new learning resources. I learned to manage my own learning, set my own learning goals. I had access to amazing technology. Why can't we learn differently? I think you're going to see a lot of teachers going back to their school leaders and say, you know, I used to be a great instructor. Now I've become a great coach, a great mentor, a great facilitator, a great evaluator. Don't put me back into a little box, you know, reading out a curriculum. And I think you're going to see many school leaders. You go back to the administrators and saying, you know, in this crisis, you left us pretty much on our own devices, but we have figured this out. You know, I connected with my neighboring school. I built networks of innovation. I learned, you know, how to, you know, reconcile social distancing with innovative learning. I think, you know, this will be with us. You know, it is about, you know, finding the right balance between disruption and coherence. No?
Wendy, the transformation is that it's easy to speak about the need for transformation, but if you are working in a grassroots level, in a classroom and so on, it can also be a scary word. And you are working with teachers globally. What do you think? There's so much discussion about that we need to have the recovery first and then transformation and so forth. What is your take? Is that, for example, teachers' point of view, do you think that there's a huge amount of excitement on the teacher level towards transformation?
I don't think our teachers see any option, honestly. Like going back to what was doesn't meet the needs of the kids and what they're bringing into classrooms. I was just on one of our kind of global forums, and the CEO of Teach for Malaysia said, you know, one thing we're seeing is, you know, there's so much exhaustion and fatigue around this idea of kind of remediating the learning loss. He's like, but where there's energy is around student leadership and engaging students in solving the problems that are in their schools and communities today. And he said, so we realized that's the way in. And of course, that is the transformation. You know, are we developing our students as leaders who can navigate uncertainty and solve increasingly complex problems and create meaningful careers in a changing economy? So I think we have no option.
But many people think that transformation automatically creates some kind of chaos. But you think that transformation actually could be the opposite, meaning is that it's creating more, it's preventing burnout and so forth? I
think it's leveraging what has emerged during this pandemic era and spreading that. Meaning, you know, we've seen so many shifts in mindsets and in practice. You know, we've seen teachers centering students' well-being and social emotional development every hour of every day. We've seen them partnering with students to say, how do we make this learning experience work? We've seen them engaging parents deeply, leveraging technology and realizing how significant a tool that can be for making learning and teaching easier and more accessible. And we've seen them engaging kids in solving problems today. So I think it's about, you know, flowing with what is emerging and ensuring that whatever's happening above our teachers in systems isn't like trying to pull them back to the dysfunctional system that already wasn't serving at least the most marginalized kids in the world.
Quite often when we are discussing about education, it almost feels like education is one. But that's not the case if you're comparing to education in global north, global south. The difference is the starting point is totally different. So let's go to global south and let's start with Fred. What is your take? Is that I think that you are definitely on the transformation camp. But what is your take from African point of view of this change needed?
Well, I would say that, you know, when I compare global south, the so-called global south and the global north, I would say that the pressure for change is slightly different. You know, in the global north, I liken it to, you know, the people are obviously starting to realize the need for change, but the pressure is less because, you know, life is you know, still very comfortable for most people in those economies, and you know, you have basic needs met and so forth. But when you look at the global south, the pressure is much greater. So one of the things I always talk about is that constraints drives innovation. So in the global south, in a place like Africa, continent like Africa, we have many constraints force us to just think differently. So you cannot do business as usual when you have a lot of constraints. So in the north, it's something like, you know, what is that saying? The frog that's in the pot that's slowly boiling and you know, not realizing that they need to change. Whereas in the global south, it's here, right? The pressure is massive, and so the need for transformation is much, much greater because we have no other choice. We cannot do business as usual. We need to reimagine, to reinvent everything because the constraints are so great.
Thanks, Fred. Vishal, we all know that pandemic has not been easy on India and on Indian education, but still on the report you write is that if we would go back to the old world, it would be a kind of like massive waste of time and money, and you would say that there's definitely need to learn from pandemic and go to something which is actually something new. So what is your take on that one, meaning Indian education post-pandemic?
Thank you, Saku. The system of education that we currently have didn't work for the large population of kids in India anyway. It was designed around a linear growth path. It is designed around memorization, rote learning, examination systems, ranking systems, exclusion systems. It is not designed around equity, justice, inclusion. So it wasn't working, and the pandemic, like Andreas also said, really brought out the cracks in the system, and the impact on kids from marginal backgrounds was massive. So the pandemic for us really gave us an opportunity to become still, to really learn to acknowledge that the system is not working for the majority of our children, and how could we now use this time of stillness to really reimagine and transform our education systems to help all children to thrive. And that was really the call that we were making out to education systems across the country, that here's a time for us to recognize that through the pandemic, there are hordes of children, hundreds of children who spend their time tilling land, working with their parents. There are hundreds of girls who might never come back into the school systems because they got married. And a big realization that what children across the world experience in the pandemic has been a lived reality for many children in many parts of India, especially children of, say, families who migrate for 6 months to an entirely another state and are not in school for 6 months, and then they come back into a whole new grade. This is the reality for them. So pandemic actually brought these issues to the forefront because it impacted all children, global north and global south. But what we have to recognize is that children in many countries in global south, including India, are living in experiences of adversity. And that adversity is not allowing them to fully engage with the learning ecosystem and fully build the capacities and skills that they need to thrive.
Thank you, Vishal. In the report, there's a proposal is that there's going to be 3 drivers we need to have in order to make the change happen. And Essie, could you briefly introduce the 3 drivers to us? And if possible, if we can also get the slide on the screen, that would be great. But Essie, the 3 drivers, please.
Sure. So through the conversations and through the learnings of the group, really these 3 drivers emerged as being not individual drivers that were in some way linear, but very much connected. And you need all 3 working together in order to really support transformation. So the first one is purpose. Are we really stepping back and thinking what we're aiming for? What are the goals and outcomes of the current education system? So not just focusing on the exams, but actually what kind of young people do we want to be developing and supporting? What do we really need this system to be delivering for us? And making sure that we're really starting on that long-term outcome before we then think about what are we going to do to solve that. The second piece is really about power and who is involved, who has the agency, who has a voice in this change. So often this change has happened top down, and this is why there is a lot of change fatigue within the system. You hear school leaders and teachers feeling exhausted by so much change happening, but often that's because change is happening to them. And what we're really talking about with transformation is change happening with those students, as Wendy was saying. And then the third piece is around practice and really unlocking the innovation and sharing new ways of possible to really support this transformation. And you can see that no one of these drivers alone would work. If you had purpose alone but imposed it on the system, then that wouldn't support this kind of transformation. If you had power and expanded agency, but it wasn't really kind of leading to different practice, then that wouldn't work. So you really need to make sure that we are collectively working towards these three drivers together, and that's when the transformation can happen.
Thank you, Essie. Let's start with the purpose, meaning is that we should be always, when we are trying to make the change happen, we always should start with the basics, fundamentals, like redefining what is the purpose of education in general. And is there one? Is it the same in every country of the world? So starting with you, Andreas, because you have the global perspective on this one, as Wendy of course too. What is the purpose of education in kind of like a short one, because we've been discussing about that one, but has it been defined clearly enough, or is it still quite fuzzy?
You know, Saku, the most interesting thing is that we rarely ask ourselves that question.
Yeah.
And we talk about the how of education, the mechanisms, the institutions, the practices, the people. We rarely ask that question, and actually the answer is very simple. You know, the purpose of education has always been to help you live with yourself, you know, help you live with people who are different from you, help you live with the planet. And then, when we operationalize those ideas, we get up to very complicated curricula, and we avoid, for example, questions around values. You know, values should always be at the center of education. That is the purpose. And we always say, well, you know, we don't know how to deal with this in education. Let's put it to the margins. Let's put the content at the center. But I do think this is the question we need to ask ourselves.
Wendy.
I agree that this is the most important question. Stepped back about 5 years ago across our global network. I think at that point we had people from 40 countries coming together to consider the question of actually what are we trying to accomplish together in 25 years? And we started looking at where will the world be in 25 years? How much the economy is changing and the planet is degrading, and just the increasingly complex problems. And we also reflected on our values as a network, one of which is that the people who've experienced the inequities of the world, those who've experienced the inequities of the world, the most marginalized of our students, should be leading the change and leading the path to the equitable and inclusive and sustainable world we envision. And reflecting on all of that together, we were struck by the fact that we needed to reorient towards a different purpose. I mean, what had initially brought us to this work was towards equity, like, you know, ensuring that this education system with its implicit purposes and goals is working for all kids. But we realized that would not be sufficient, and that we would need to work to ensure that the students in our classrooms are developing as leaders who can shape a better future for themselves and all of us. And we could say that at the global level, and all of us could agree that that's going to be our orienting purpose, but that's not sufficient, right? Ultimately, we need to come together in every diverse community across the world with diverse stakeholders, students and families and educators and other civic leaders and others to reflect on this question. What does this look like in our given community? To ensure that students in this community are developing as leaders who can shape a better future, considering our local values and culture and history, considering the actual challenges and opportunities facing kids. What is that going to look like within this particular context?
Fred and Vishal, from your point of view, do you have a feeling is that there's agreement on what the purpose of education should be in the following 10 to 20 years? And do you have a feeling is that it's practically the same as what you just heard from Andreas and Wendy? Fred?
I do think that there are clearly different perspectives on the purpose of education. I mean, one thing that I haven't heard mentioned yet is education as a tool for society to develop, right? So there's obviously the individual imperative of education for someone to progress in society, to prepare a young person for life, to be successful, to get employment, to be able to find fulfillment in life and so forth. But there's also a very important role that education plays in terms of moving society forward. So, you know, think about for any, country or continent to develop, you need, financial capital, you need human capital, and you need technology, right? And so the human capital element of a society developing is, education is a critical tool for development. And one of the things that, in theory, it's getting faster and faster for societies to develop because they're able to leverage knowledge from a society that has developed before them. But that only happens if you educate your society, your people. So just look at how fast Dubai has developed. You think about how fast China has developed. Much, much faster than it took Europe to develop, right? And because we were able to borrow the technologies, the ideas from the previous society that developed and leapfrog. And that's what education does. So it's a phenomenal tool for developing society.
Thank you, Fred. Vishal.
Yep, thank you, Saku. Many thoughts, in my mind, and I'll probably try to address a couple of them. I think overall I agree with what Andreas is pointing out. The role of education is really around personal, interpersonal, and the larger planet. And in the morning plenary, Manish Sisodia ji talked about shift how education needs to be used to develop mindsets for society. And I think Fred is also talking about that, around the role of education in shaping society. But we also have to then look into what kind of society do we want to shape. The education system so far has created the level of inequities that we see around the world. The people for whom education worked, which was the top 15-20%, went on to become leaders in the world and made certain choices which are impacting the most marginalized, right? I mean, somewhere out there, someone decided that it's great to throw all our garbage in the oceans, not really considering the values around making choices like that. Right. So, it's great to have a bold, broad statement that this is the purpose of education, but we'll have to nuance it down into values of equity, justice. We have to nuance it down to, is education working for every child down the road? I'll give you an example from India. We were working with a state which works with kids in the Tribal Welfare Society, and they run residential schools for children who come from tribal backgrounds. And the primary challenge that we identified and the team identified was that of identity. That even with high quality education, when they went out into society, because they came from a lower caste system, they wouldn't get access to housing, they wouldn't get access to quality of life, they wouldn't get access to jobs, they wouldn't get access to be contributing members of society. So where are those values of justice and equity playing out? So for them, the core purpose of education was focused on dignity and building a sense of identity, which gave them the agency to then go out and claim what is rightfully theirs, and then be contributing members of society. So we will have to qualify this motherhood purpose of education with core values that then bring in ideas of equity, inclusion, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishal. And then to Essie, we've been discussing that all these drivers, they are not separate, but they are linked together. And from purpose, the next one is power. And I think that the key of the power in here is that so much of the discussion about the change is happening top-down. And in power, you mean is that we need to create a genuine agency on every level of the system and so on. So could you kind of explain what is the role of having everyone on board, increasing the dialogue and so on in the process?
And I think Wendy had already touched on this when she's talking about some of the changes that have come to bear during the pandemic, but it's really thinking about the reality of a young person at the center of a learning ecosystem and really thinking about, we have in the way that we traditionally have thought about education in school, we kind of put almost these artificial structures about where learning happens. But actually, when you flip the focus and put the young person in the center, there are so many different places, informal and formal, that learning happens. And so you have obviously the teachers in the schools play a fundamental part at the heart of education, but these young people are also in a broader community. They have parents, they have local employers. So really thinking about, if we are broadening this purpose of education, not just putting that onto the teachers and imposing that they take on more things, but we're really unlocking the natural kind of opportunity of all of these other actors who are already out there and making sure that we're asking the young people, asking the teachers, asking the leaders, asking the families what they can do and how they can be involved in the change.
Thank you, Essie. Let's talk briefly about the positives and negatives. Andreas, where do you see the energy needed to come to this process, and where do you see the possible obstacles or roadmaps in this? It's a massive question, but briefly.
Yeah, first of all, I really like the turn wheel that Big Change is putting to us here, purpose, practice, and power, but the turn wheel only turns when there is some wind, when there is some energy, and I actually think this is going to come from the young learners today, what they actually bring with them. In the past, last few years or last decades, we have sort of commodified education. We made students consumers of learning content. We made teachers service providers. We made parents clients, and that has created a distance that actually are now overcoming. I think after this pandemic, we all understand that learning and education is not a transactional business, but a social, a relational enterprise. And I do think, learners are getting at the heart of the change. We also see, I think, like Essie just mentioned, we are seeing actually schools opening up to new stakeholders, building new relationships. Co-creation is the kind of word of our times. Agency, the capacity of people to drive things, to do things, co-agency. We live in dialogue, collective agency, where the whole is bigger than its pieces. I do think those are the ones that actually will power that turbine.
Thanks, Andreas. Let's move to practice. And Wendy, you are running a massively influential global operation. Can you give us some examples of what the change could look like? Because we were discussing about the cooperation you are having between the teachers, which is impressive and beautiful. So how do you see the change happening from your point of view?
Well, sort of following on some of Andreas's comments and Essie's, ultimately, when we've seen communities make progress, like really seen the outcomes for kids change, we've seen that it's not about, I think we often tend to think that system change is government change, but what we've seen in these communities is many people exerting, again, what we would call collective leadership. What we see is students and teachers and school leaders and system leaders and folks outside, really around the whole ecosystem around kids and policymakers and government, we see leadership exerted at every one of those levels. And we see where things are happening the fastest, people rowing in the same direction. I think what we haven't done enough of in education is really intentionally invest in cultivating that leadership. And I hope that we'll come out of this pandemic era with a new recognition about the importance of local leadership. Where kids kept learning, it was always about teachers, parents, and other students and administrators leaning in, leveraging their relationships and making it happen. And I hope we won't have some idea that we're going to reinvent the system without that people power. But it's going to take a lot more investment than we've made, and that's collectively to this point. And that's what the Teach for All Network is working to do, is to say, how do we make a really intentional effort to cultivate local leadership capacity that is both locally rooted in context and culture and values, and exposed to what's possible and what's working in other places. And I think that's what we were talking about this morning, just the power of ensuring that our local leaders are connected globally so that they can see what's happening in other places, but then adapt and contextualize those solutions to their context. And I think if we can do that, we can massively increase the pace of change in education.
And actually one of the possible silver linings in pandemic could be the increased global cooperation. So let's keep that going strong as well. Fred and Vishal, from your point of view, how does the path to change happen? Can you give us some concrete examples of the work you are doing at the moment in Africa, outside of Africa and India? Let's start with Fred.
In our case, when we looked at developing a higher education system, if you're going to do it the traditional way, for example, build something like Oxford, you need 1,000 years you need thousands of professors with PhDs, and you need billions of dollars. We have none of those three things in Africa. We don't have 1,000 years. We have 15 years before we have the largest workforce in the world. We don't have billions of dollars. We have maybe millions if you're lucky. And we don't have thousands of professors with PhDs. So we have to reimagine everything. And so transformation in our context, what we have built in the African Leadership Group is a system of education which is not dependent on professors. It's based on students, and therefore we've removed. It's not built around a scarce resource. It's built around an abundant resource, where students teach themselves and they teach each other through peer-to-peer learning. Where also, it also looks like a recognition of the fact that when universities were built hundreds of years ago, we lived in a world where information was scarce. So you had to get it from the head of that professor or from the library book. But today we live in a world where information is ubiquitous, right? And so a young person can teach themselves, they can teach each other in different ways. And so these are so through all this, we're also really leaning into this model of that, learning happens best by doing, not in the classroom. And so, we really leverage this whole 10-20-70 rule of learning. 10% of your learning from the classroom, 20% from your mentors and peers, and 70% from doing. So with all of this, we've been able to develop a system of higher education where we are producing world-class human capital at 5% of the cost of doing it in traditional in the West, for example. And our graduates are able to compete at the highest levels. So typically when education has been high quality, it has been high cost. When it's been high, scale, it has been low quality. And what we have been able to do is develop something that is both high quality and high scale and low cost. And that is radical transformation.
Thank you, Fred. Vishal.
Two lenses I'll bring in, Saku, here. One is the lens around when we create environments of agency and co-agency. It is not always easy for learners who have agency then to kind of compete with also social cultural norms that are well established in an education ecosystem. Imagine a young woman who comes from a conservative family, a conservative background, who now has the agency to go out and make healthy choices in life and wants to make bold, radical choices for herself. And then you have a system of family and an extended family that says, no, but women in our culture don't do that. So a key aspect of shift that we need to bring in practice is mindset shift in the larger ecosystem of adults. All of us, even on this panel, are products of a conventional education system which has been rooted in a certain socio-cultural system. So we have certain ways of being in society, and that's getting challenged now when we bring the young person at the center of this learning and give agency and power to the young person, which means then are we ready for the teacher to take a back seat and let go of the power that they've held on to for so many decades? For that, we have to then prepare ourselves as adults, right? So that's one important question that we have to sit on. The second is, again, going back to what Manish Sisodia spoke about in the morning, is what we've done in some of these systems in the state is introducing radically new ideas as experiments, the happiness curriculum, the citizenship curriculum, and the entrepreneurship mindset curriculum that the Delhi government has introduced. Now, why are they radical? One is those ideas itself are radical because they're challenging the core purpose of education from academic excellence and job achievement to well-being and thriving as ideas and purposes of education. But what they've also done is they've broken into a very siloed and fixed school calendar, which had 6 subjects, daily, mathematics, languages, sciences. And now we have introduced something which is focused on well-being, on mindfulness practices, on mental health. Now we've introduced something where you're giving agency to a young person to become an entrepreneur and become a job creator. So what that has done is started to shift mindsets of teachers, of department heads in education, of parents also, that yes, a different kind of education purpose is possible, and here are actual practices of what can be done. Similarly, in Telangana, where we spoke about the tribal welfare system, we are helping them design a curriculum called the Freedom Curriculum, which is corely rooted into ideas of dignity and identity. to help these young people build the agency to be able to go out and make healthy, bold, radical choices for themselves. So there's a lot of innovations that are happening in the system, which now need to become mainstream in education if we truly want to focus on transformation.
Thank you, Vishal. One provocation more is that how human mind works is that when we hear a specific word, we almost automatically think of something. And when we hear the word school, we are thinking about the building, we are thinking about the curriculum, the classrooms, and so on. And if we want to make a transformation, maybe we should start using some other word as well, just a provocation. But let's finish this panel with a really kind of like complex question to which I'm asking simple and short answers because we are having 4 minutes left. So the question is, okay, what should we do? Meaning is that what are the key next steps? Is it mostly about funding? Is it mostly about mindset? Is it mostly about global cooperation? If you have to simplify this one, and let's start with Essie. What would be kind of like your next steps to the change?
Yeah, it's not a simple question. I think that one thing is just actually shifting, as you say, the language and what we're thinking about. If we only think about school innovation, then we only think about changing and do we have room to fit something in the timetable, and so expanding our horizons. I do think that there is a key role for leaders and funders to think about what are we supporting and how are we making sure that we are not just putting flows of funding into individual programs, but thinking about how are we supporting agency within the system, more joined up working and more sharing of information. So there are different roles that all of us need to play to support this transformation. And I think on behalf of funders and leaders, we need to make sure that we're thinking about how inadvertently we may have been blocking change and innovation in the past, and how we might need to think differently about the type of permissions and support that we give to the system to really rise to this opportunity.
Thank you. Then Vishal, Fred, brief answers. What would be your kind of like simple next steps? Vishal.
We have to really start looking at education as a long-term game, not a 5-year electoral game, a political game, but really start looking at what kind of society do we see 25 years from now, and what do we need to do today so that we have a society like that 25 years from now. So a long-term vision, and supported by that is core mindset shifts, core shifts in belief systems, in value systems, in how we see ourselves as part of the society. Do we see ourselves as exclusive, privileged, or do we see ourselves as equal in society? And how do we then ensure every child gets access to an education that helps them thrive?
Thank you, Vishal. Fred.
I believe that, for transformation to truly take effect and not just be a box ticking exercise, I think you need 3 things. You need leadership, and really the courage that comes from leadership. Secondly, we need mindset change. People are talking a lot about, you need technology to transform education. I believe that mindset is more important than technology to really reimagine education. And then finally, we need to bring people along, because we must realize that, this is one of the most precious and emotive subjects in society. So, we have to find ways to bring people along and therefore to get broad buy-in for the transformation that's needed.
Thank you, Fred. And then Andreas.
Yeah, I'm sure money is important, but let's use the most important resources first, and that is the people in the system. If our education systems knew what students and teachers know, then we would live in a different world. I think we need to mobilize the energy that is in the system and bring it to bear. And I do think we need to more carefully understand what makes change so difficult. We are all born for a world that we like to keep in balance, and living in an imbalanced world takes real energy. And we need to understand the asymmetries. The costs are immediate and certain. The benefits of change are uncertain in the long run. And I do think once we understand those dynamics, I think we can embrace change and we can use the resources within the system and then hopefully add more money as well.
And the last word to Wendy.
I would say three things. One, we need to step back in our countries and communities all over the world and reconsider purpose. Two, we need to make huge investments in the leadership of everyone in the system, to Andreas's point. And three, we need new learning systems. We don't learn across communities and countries in education, and we need to figure out how to get our educators in networks that enable them to learn across borders, which again has huge potential to finally accelerate progress in education.
Thank you, Wendy. We will continue the discussions in Loft, most likely around 1. We might be slightly delayed, but this afternoon. So if you want to continue these discussions, please join us. And please do download the report from the website of Big Change. The address is there. Thank you so much.